Hi. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when, where you are watching it. I'm sure I got at least one of those right. My name is Isaiah, and this is the first video on my new channel, so thank you for watching. I appreciate it. And thank you in advance for sticking around. This channel is going to be largely about cybernetics. From time to time, I might talk about other things which interest me, but cybernetics is going to be the main thing. Now, if you're anything like I was 2 years ago, when a good friend of mine introduced this idea to me, the first thing that probably pops into your mind when I mention cybernetics is a dude with like a funky robot hand or a glowing red eye. If you're my parents' age, it's probably that scene from Terminator 2 where the Terminator pulls all that skin off his hand and wiggles around his robot fingers. And if you're my age, it's probably cyberpunk. But that isn't what cybernetics is. So that begs the question, what is it? Well, in the simplest terms, cybernetics is the study of systems. Specifically, systems in which cause and effect do not move in a straight line, but instead form circles. Put a pin in that. In such systems, the output of a process eventually becomes its own input again. The circular structure is what we call feedback. Now, if that sounds a little abstract, don't worry. Feedback is actually something you encounter every day. I can give you a couple examples, just so you can paint that picture in your mind's eye. I'm from Michigan, which, in my humble opinion, is the best state in the union. And the temperatures here are, well, YouTube doesn't let you swear anymore, so let's just say creative. I like to say we're God's punching bag when it comes to weather. It can be snowing one minute, sunny the next, and throughout all that, because I'm still human, my body has to regulate its temperature. Otherwise, I'd look like Frosty the Snowman, and then maybe 20 seconds later, I'd look like Frosty the Puddle. Your body regulating its temperature is a feedback system. The input eventually becomes the output, which becomes the next input. When you sweat, it's because you're hot. And when you get too cooled down, you're cool. But if you get too cold, you start to shiver. All that good stuff. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. I'm also clumsy, believe it or not, and from time to time, I can trip over air. But my brain adjusts for that, and I catch myself before I face plant into the hardwood floors and ruin them, because they are unfinished. Your brain adjusting your balance when you trip over something is also a feedback system. So how did cybernetics come about, right? The field emerged during the Second World War through the work of the mathematician Norbert Wiener, who noticed something remarkable. Machines and living organisms seem to share a similar structure. Now I know, that sounds crazy, but think about it for a second. Both could receive information, process that information, and adjust their behavior in response. In other words, both of them can be understood as systems. Wiener developed these insights in his 1948 book, Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and Machine, which laid the foundations for the modern study of cybernetics. The term itself, cybernetics, comes from the Greek word kybernetes, which means steersman. But before we go any further, we do need to clarify something very basic, because this comes up a lot when you're talking about the field. What exactly is a system? Well, I kind of gestured at it a little bit, but in cybernetics, a system is simply a set of elements that are connected in such a way that their interactions produce a unified pattern of behavior. The elements themselves can be almost anything. They might be neurons in your brain, organisms in an ecosystem, circuits in a machine, or individuals. in their community or communities in a larger society. What matters is not so much what the parts are made out of, but how they are related to one another. A system, in other words, is defined less by its substance and more by its organization. Cybernetics is interested in the patterns of relation, who influences whom, how signals travel, and how the whole structure responds to change. But most cybernetic systems share a few basic characteristics. First, they contain components that interact with one another. Second, these interactions allow for the flow of signals, energy, or information through the system. And third, and most importantly, these flows form feedback loops, meaning that the effects of a process return to influence the process itself. So, let's think of an example, shall we? A thermostat is a classic example of one of these systems. The thermostat measures the temperature of a room. Mine is set at 55 because that's the coldest it can go before I run the risk of my pipes freezing. Some people like to set it at 70. I had a friend once who kept his house at 80 degrees, and that poor man, must have spent so much keeping all of his clothes clean, because I would have sweat through everything I owned if I just kept my house at 80 degrees. But whatever you set it at, the thermostat has to measure the temperature of a room. And if the temperature drops below that temperature that you set the thermostat at, the heater kicks on. The heater will raise the temperature, which the thermostat will measure again, and once it's set to whatever you set that thermostat at, it sends a signal and it kicks the heater off. In other terms, the system regulates itself through a continuous loop of measurement, response, and correction. Now, admittedly, this might sound a little bit mundane. Hopefully, I didn't bore any of you to sleep. But cybernetics takes that simple idea and applies it everywhere. Think back to the word I said, transdisciplinary, everywhere. Biology, ecology, engineering, economics, psychology, social systems. Anywhere you can think of, you can apply cybernetics. Which means if you've ever tried to fix one small problem in a group of people and you've accidentally created 3 new ones, congratulations! You've already experienced a complex and cybernetic system. Maybe in the future I'll talk about a few of those systems that I deal with in the workplace. But another important concept is the idea of a system boundary. Every system exists within an environment, and we distinguish the system from that environment by drawing a boundary around the process we are studying. Sometimes that boundary is physical, but a good majority of the time it's conceptual. So a brain can be studied as a system. An economy can be studied as a system. A political movement can be studied as a system. Even just the interactions in your own family can be studied as a system. Later thinkers pushed these ideas even further. In the 1960s and the 1970s, between whatever it was they were doing at that time, because the 60s and 70s were a crazy time period, theorists such as, and I'm going to butcher this name here, Heinz von Foerster argued that cybernetics should also examine the observer who defines the system. This approach became known as second-order cybernetics. So instead of pretending that the observer stands outside of their system, second-order cybernetics recognizes that the observer is always a part of the system being described. In other words, the act of observing a system is, in and of itself, part of the system. And once you start beginning to think in these terms, you start to see cybernetic structures everywhere. In communities, in family, in human cognition, in your economy, and this is where I find it to be the most fascinating, even in theology. And all that is exactly what I hope that this channel is going to explore. Because it turns out once you start looking at the world through the lens of cybernetics, you begin to notice that a lot of things we thought were mysterious are actually structured. And that a lot of things which we thought were structured are just very complicated feedback loops. So it's a very interesting field of study. And thank you for sticking around and listening to me talk for a little bit. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Watch out for deer, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.